What if the reason you're still stuck has nothing to do with how hard you work? Most people believe success comes from working harder, waking up earlier, hustling longer. So they push. They grind. They sacrifice sleep, relationships, weekends. And yet 5 years later, they're standing in almost the exact same place. That's not bad luck. That's not laziness. It's something else entirely, something almost nobody talks about. The top 1% didn't get there by working harder than you. In many cases, they worked less. They just worked on something different. They were solving a different problem than the one you've been solving your whole life. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to look at your daily habits, the small, invisible ones, and realize they've been quietly writing the story of your entire future. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. Here's the strange part. Nobody sits you down and teaches you this. Not in school, not at home, not even in most workplaces. You're taught to follow instructions, get good grades, keep your head down, and wait for permission. But permission never comes. And one day you wake up in your 30s or 40s or 50s, successful on paper maybe, but hollow underneath, wondering where the years went. This isn't a video about motivation. Motivation fades by Thursday. This is about something sturdier, a way of seeing the world that once installed in your mind changes every decision you make afterward. Because here's the truth. The top 1% aren't 1% smarter. They aren't 1% more talented. In most cases, they aren't even 1% luckier. What separates them is a set of thinking patterns so small, so quiet, that everyone else walks right past them every single day. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what those patterns are. You'll see why some people turn one bad year into a comeback story, while others turn one bad year into a life sentence. You'll understand why two people can start with the exact same resources and end up in entirely different worlds 10 years later. And you'll walk away with something practical. Not a slogan, not a poster on a wall, but a way of operating that you can start using before you even finish watching. Let's start with the first shift, because it's the one that unlocks everything else. Most people think their outer life is shaped by outer circumstances. The economy, their boss, their family, the city they were born in. And to be fair, circumstances matter. Nobody's pretending they don't. But here's what almost nobody notices. Circumstances explain the starting line, not the finish line. There's an old story about two brothers raised by the same alcoholic, abusive father. Same house, same wounds, same chaos. Years later, a researcher tracked them down. One brother had become an alcoholic himself, spiraling through failed jobs and broken relationships. The other had built a stable career, a strong marriage, a peaceful home. When asked why he turned out the way he did, each brother gave the exact same answer. What do you expect? Look at the father I had. Same wound. Two completely different meanings assigned to it. One brother decided his past was a life sentence. The other decided it was a warning label. Same event, different interpretation, entirely different destiny. This is the first hidden law of the top 1%. They don't control what happens to them any more than you do. But they've trained themselves to control what happens inside them after it happens. That gap, the space between the event and your response to the event, is where your whole future actually gets built. Most people never even notice that gap exists. They think reaction is automatic, unavoidable, hardwired. It isn't. It's a habit. And habits can be rebuilt. But here's where it gets uncomfortable, because knowing this isn't the same as living it. Because if that gap is real, if the response really is a choice, then something shifts. You can no longer blame the traffic, the market, the manager, the ex, the economy for the story of your life. That's terrifying to some people. It's also the most liberating sentence they'll ever hear, because it means the story isn't finished. It means the pen is still in your hand, which brings us to the next problem. And this one trips up almost everyone, including people who are otherwise brilliant. Most people are optimizing for comfort, disguised as safety. Think about your own week for a second. How many decisions this week were made to avoid discomfort rather than to move toward something meaningful? The snooze button, the conversation you didn't have, the idea you didn't pitch because someone might say no. Each one felt small, each one felt reasonable in the moment, but stack 10 years of those small, reasonable choices on top of each other, and you get a life quietly built around avoidance instead of purpose. Here's what almost nobody notices about comfort. It doesn't stay the same size. It shrinks the room you're willing to live in every single year you feed it. The boundaries of your comfort zone tightened a little more each time you choose the easy path, until eventually the zone is so small that even ordinary requests, a phone call, a hard conversation, a new opportunity, feel unbearable. Meanwhile, the top 1% made peace with something most people spend their whole lives running from. Discomfort is not a warning sign. It's a growth signal. There's a story about a young accountant, unremarkable by every conventional measure, working a forgettable job at a lumber company. He wasn't the smartest person in the office. He wasn't the most talented. But he had one trait almost nobody else had. He asked for feedback that stung on purpose, over and over, because he understood something the others didn't. Praise feels good and teaches you nothing. Discomfort feels bad and teaches you everything. He sought out the very thing everyone else avoided. And that single habit, deliberately walking toward productive discomfort, while everyone else fled from it, is the quiet engine behind almost every meaningful transformation in his life. It's the same engine behind almost every transformation you've ever admired in someone else, even if you never noticed it operating in the background. But this creates another problem, one even trickier than the first. Because once you accept that discomfort is useful, a new question appears. Which discomfort? Not all pain builds you. Some pain just wears you down for nothing. And this is where most people, even ambitious ones, quietly sabotage themselves without realizing it. They confuse being busy with being productive. Picture two people. One spends 12 hours a day in motion, emails, meetings, notifications, a never-ending scroll of tasks that feel urgent. The other spends 4 hours a day on one thing that actually matters and rests deliberately for the remaining time. Ask most people which one is working harder, and they'll point to the first person without hesitation. But here's what nobody tells you. Motion and progress are not the same thing. Motion feels productive. It gives you the emotional reward of tiredness, the satisfaction of a full calendar, the illusion of importance. Progress, on the other hand, often feels quiet, even boring, because it's usually just 1 or 2 decisions, repeated with discipline, over a long stretch of time. The top 1% obsess over a brutally simple question that most people never even ask. Is this action moving the actual outcome forward, or is it just making me feel busy? That single filter, applied daily, silently separates people who accumulate results from people who accumulate exhaustion. Here's where things become interesting, though, because this next part explains why so many talented, hard-working people still stay stuck for decades. It's the compounding trap, and it's invisible, which is exactly what makes it so dangerous. Imagine 2 people at 25, same intelligence, same starting salary. One person reads for 30 minutes a night. The other watches television for 30 minutes a night. On day 1, there's zero visible difference between them. Even after a month, you couldn't tell them apart from the outside. A year in, still barely noticeable. This is the part almost nobody has the patience for, because compounding is boring in the beginning and overwhelming at the end, and the beginning lasts far longer than anyone wants it to. But 10 years later, one of them has absorbed the equivalent of dozens of books worth of frameworks, mental models, historical patterns, and hard-earned lessons from other people's failures. The other has absorbed 10 years of entertainment that leaves no residue behind. Nobody could have predicted the exact size of the gap on day 1, but the gap was never really about day 1. It was about which direction the curve was bending, every single day, while nobody was watching. This is the part that separates people permanently, and it has almost nothing to do with talent. It has to do with what you repeatedly choose to do when the outcome is invisible. Most people stop here, right at the invisible stretch, which is exactly why they never succeed. They want proof the effort is working before they're willing to continue the effort. But the entire nature of compounding is that it refuses to show proof early. It demands trust before evidence, discipline before reward, patience before results. The people who make it are simply the ones who kept showing up during the part where nothing seemed to be happening. Now here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. What have you stopped doing, right at the exact point where the results were about to start becoming visible? Let's talk about something even more uncomfortable, because this next pattern is the one people resist admitting the most. The top 1% guard their inputs the way most people guard their bank accounts. Think about what actually enters your mind on an average day. The tone of the first conversation you have, the content on the screen during your first 30 scrolling minutes, the words of the people closest to you. Every single one of those inputs becomes raw material your brain uses to construct your mood, your confidence, your decisions, your entire outlook for the day. Here's what almost nobody notices. You would never let a stranger walk into your house and rearrange your furniture without asking. But most people allow strangers on a screen to rearrange their emotional furniture every single morning, without a second thought, simply by opening an app before their feet even hit the floor. There's a well-known story about 5 friends and a study that tracked their outcomes over the following decade. The finding was uncomfortable but consistent. Your income, your habits, your ambitions, even your health tend to average out to match the 5 people you spend the most time with. Not because of magic, because of exposure. You absorb the standards of whoever surrounds you, whether you intend to or not. This is why the top 1% are almost obsessive about 2 things: who they let close and what they let in. Not out of arrogance, out of self-preservation. They understand that willpower is a limited resource, but environment runs on autopilot. Design the environment correctly, and you no longer need constant willpower to fight it. What happens next surprises almost everyone, including people who've heard this idea before and dismissed it as too simple to matter. Because the environment doesn't just shape your habits, it shapes your identity. And identity, quietly, shapes everything else. Here's the deeper layer almost nobody talks about. Most people try to change their behavior first and hope their identity eventually catches up. They set a goal, save more money, get in shape, build a business, and then grind against their old identity every single day, fighting themselves for every inch of progress. It's exhausting, and it's also why so many resolutions die by February. The top 1% flip the order entirely. They decide who they are first and let the behavior follow naturally from that decision. Not I'm trying to save money, but I am someone who doesn't waste money. Not I'm trying to exercise, but I am someone who trains. The subtle shift in language sounds almost too small to matter. But identity-based decisions require far less willpower than goal-based ones, because you're no longer fighting your own self-image every time temptation shows up. You're simply acting in alignment with who you've already decided you are. There's a story about a struggling salesman, decades ago, standing in front of a mentor, complaining about how unfair the market was, how difficult the clients were, how nothing seemed to work no matter how hard he tried. The mentor listened patiently, then asked one devastating question. What if the market isn't the problem? What if you're the problem the market keeps rejecting? It wasn't cruelty. It was the most useful sentence that salesman ever heard, because it moved the entire locus of control back into his own hands. He didn't need the market to change. He needed to become someone the market couldn't ignore. And that shift, from blaming outside forces to rebuilding the self-standing at the center of the story, is the exact same shift that shows up again and again in nearly every transformation story worth telling. But this raises a harder question, one most people avoid, because the answer requires actual honesty. If you're not where you want to be, what identity have you been unconsciously practicing every single day? Let's go even deeper, because there's a pattern here that explains why some people recover from failure quickly, while others never fully recover at all. The top 1% treat failure as data. Everyone else treats failure as verdict. Picture two people who both lose a significant amount of money on a business idea that collapses. One walks away thinking, "I'm not cut out for this. I should never have tried." The other walks away thinking, "Interesting. That pricing model didn't work. That timing was wrong. That partner wasn't the right fit." Same failure. Two entirely different internal sentences. And those internal sentences determine everything that happens next. The first person has turned a single event into an identity. The second person has turned it into information. One closes a door forever. The other opens a notebook. There's a widely known story about an inventor who failed thousands of times while trying to perfect a working light bulb. When a reporter asked how it felt to fail so many times, his answer reframed the entire concept of failure for generations afterward. He hadn't failed, he had simply discovered thousands of methods that didn't work, each one bringing him measurably closer to the one that would. That's not spin. That's a fundamentally different operating system for processing setbacks. And here's the part that matters for you specifically. This reframe isn't reserved for geniuses or inventors. It's available to anyone willing to ask a different question after failure. Instead of, "Why does this always happen to me?" the top 1% ask, "What is this trying to teach me before I'm allowed to move to the next level?" Here's what almost nobody notices about that question. It doesn't just soften the pain, it shortens the recovery time. People who ask why me stay stuck in the wound for months, sometimes years. People who ask what now are often moving again within days. Most people stop here at the wound, replaying the same failure on a loop, mistaking the replay for reflection. But replaying pain isn't the same as extracting the lesson from it. One keeps you circling the same spot on the map. The other moves you forward on it. Before we get there, though, there's one more layer hiding underneath everything you've heard so far, and it might be the most overlooked piece of all. Most people plan their week. The top 1% plan their decade, and then reverse engineer today from it. Think about how strange this actually is. People will spend an entire evening planning a 2-week vacation, researching flights, comparing hotels, mapping out every single day down to the hour. Yet ask those same people where they want their life to be in 10 years, and most of them go quiet or worse. They laugh it off as if the question itself is naive. Here's what almost nobody notices. A life without a distant target isn't more free, it's more reactive. Without a clear picture of where you're going, every incoming request, every shiny distraction, every comfortable detour starts to feel equally important because you have no filter to measure it against. Everything competes for your attention, and nothing wins clearly, so you drift toward whatever feels urgent in the moment, instead of what actually matters over time. There's a story about a young clerk working an unremarkable retail job, the kind of position most people treat as a dead end rather than a beginning. But this particular clerk did something almost nobody else in that store did. Every night he wrote down, in detail, the exact life he intended to be living in 5 years. Not vague hopes, but specific numbers, specific skills, specific responsibilities. His co-workers thought it was strange, even a little arrogant. 5 years later, while most of them were still standing behind the same counter, he was running operations for a company that didn't exist yet when he started writing. The vision didn't do the work for him. Let's be clear about that. But it did something just as important. It told him which of his daily decisions actually mattered, and which ones were just noise dressed up as urgency. A vivid, distant target has a strange, almost magnetic effect on your daily choices. It quietly filters out the requests, the distractions, and the detours that don't lead anywhere near it. Here's where things become interesting, because this next piece explains why so many people set goals and still end up nowhere near them. They confuse a goal with a wish. A wish lives comfortably in your head, unthreatened, because it never has to survive contact with a deadline or a plan. A goal, on the other hand, has a date attached to it, a visible measurement, and a cost you've already agreed to pay in advance. The top 1% are relentless about converting wishes into goals as quickly as possible, precisely because a wish can hide from accountability forever, while a goal cannot. And this connects to something even more uncomfortable. Most people are secretly afraid to define success clearly, because a clear definition makes failure visible too. Vague dreams are comfortable exactly because they can never technically be missed. You can't fail at something you never actually defined, but you also can't ever really succeed at it either. The fog that protects you from disappointment is the exact same fog that keeps you from ever arriving anywhere. The top 1% trade that comfortable fog for uncomfortable clarity on purpose, because clarity is the only thing that makes real progress measurable. And measurable progress is the only kind that compounds. Now we're getting close to the part that ties everything together. And this is where the stakes get considerably higher. Because this next principle is the one that determines whether everything you've heard so far actually sticks, or quietly fades by next Tuesday like every other piece of advice you've ever consumed. It's the principle of the compounding decision, the single choice, repeated daily, that outweighs almost every other factor combined. Here's a question worth sitting with. If you could only keep one habit for the rest of your life, and had to delete every other productivity trick, every hack, every system, which single habit would move the needle the most? For the top 1%, the answer is almost always some version of the same thing. Daily, deliberate, uncomfortable growth, applied consistently, even in small doses, even when motivation is nowhere to be found. Not intensity, consistency, not a heroic burst of effort followed by collapse. A quiet, almost boring repetition that nobody claps for, that nobody posts about, that produces no visible reward for a long, long time. There's a story about a young cellist who wanted to become extraordinary. Every day for years, he practiced the same difficult passage, not the parts he already played beautifully, but specifically the parts that exposed his weaknesses. Friends who practiced their strengths sounded more impressive in the short term. They could show off in a room, get quick applause, feel talented in the moment. But a decade later, the cellist who spent his hours in the uncomfortable, unglamorous corners of his weaknesses was the only one still playing on the world's biggest stages. The others had plateaued years earlier, comfortable in what already sounded good, never willing to sit in what sounded bad long enough to fix it. This is the exact same principle hiding underneath every domain of life that actually matters: business, relationships, health, craft. The people who win long-term are rarely the most naturally gifted in the room. They're the ones willing to spend the most time in the specific discomfort that everyone else quietly avoids. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you, in the most useful way possible. You already know, right now, without needing another video or another book, exactly which uncomfortable thing you've been avoiding. You knew it before this video even started. The information was never actually missing. The willingness was. So let's bring this all the way home, because everything you've heard tonight connects into a single, simple thread. The gap between the event and your response. That's where your power lives. The discomfort you've been avoiding, that's where your growth lives. The 5 people around you and the inputs you consume, that's where your ceiling gets built or broken. The identity you practice daily, not the goal you occasionally chase. That's where lasting change actually comes from. The failure you're still replaying, that's not a verdict. It's data, waiting for you to finally read it correctly. And the single, boring, unglamorous habit you repeat every day when nobody's watching, when there's no applause, when the results are still invisible. That's the real dividing line between the 1% and everyone else standing at the starting line beside them. None of this requires more talent than you already have. None of it requires a different past, a different family, a different set of circumstances than the ones you were handed. It requires one decision made today, and then made again tomorrow, and then made again the day after that, long after it stops feeling exciting and starts feeling like simply who you are. The people who change their entire life rarely experience one dramatic, cinematic turning point. Almost always, when you trace the real story backward, you find a quiet decision made on an ordinary day that looked exactly like every other day, that simply never got abandoned. That's the whole secret. Not magic, not luck, not some hidden shortcut the top 1% found and everyone else missed. Just a decision that was kept. So here's the only question left that actually matters. Not what you'll do someday, not what you'll start next Monday, not what you'll finally commit to once things settle down. What is the one uncomfortable, unglamorous, invisible decision you're willing to keep, starting today, even before you can see any proof that it's working? Because the proof was never the point where this begins. The decision is. If this shifted the way you see things, subscribe, because the next lesson builds directly on this one, and it might be the piece that finally makes everything click.